CNN hosted a town hall with Tulsi Gabbard over the weekend, and even though I was happy that they gave her this opportunity to kind of get her name out there, it was obvious that they were no fans of Tulsi Gabbard, and it was as if she walked into a lion's den because she really had no real opportunity to get her ideas out there and talk about policy. She was essentially forced to play defense for probably a majority of this town hall. Now, with that being said, I still do think that she performed well given the circumstances, but I mean, they treated her as if she was a bad person and that was the default position, and she needed to prove to us that she wasn't a bad person. And everything, even positives about her, were spun in a way and framed in a way to try to make her look bad. So an example of that is this question that was asked about her supposedly taking a contradictory stance because, well, if you are anti-interventionist, then how do you reconcile that fact that you were a troop? Literally, somebody asked this question.
How can you be both an anti-interventionist and also serve in the military?
That was one of the dumbest questions I've ever heard anyone ask at one of these town halls, because it was clear that that person was trying to do like a gotcha. And we see this with Bernie Sanders and AOC. People will say, oh, well, you're hypocrites because you ride in cars and airplanes, but yet you say that we need to get off fossil fuels. Gotcha. This is kind of what I thought when I saw her ask that question. Oh, you claim to be against regime change, but yet you fought in a war. Gotcha. Except if you listen to whatever Tulsi says, whenever she talks about this, she says that the reason why she's so vehemently against regime change wars is because she herself fought in one, and it's that experience that changed her mind. So the fact that you would even try to word it in a way, I'm surprised that people aren't freaking out and saying, how could you talk to a troop this way? Because we all know if Dan Crenshaw was asked this question, the establishment would lose their minds. But since it's Tulsi Gabbard, all of a sudden, you know, she's fair game, and we can literally criticize her for being a veteran. Unbelievable. So that's just one of the many examples of bias where it was framed in this antagonistic way where the default position is Tulsi bad, prove that you're not bad. Now, additionally, on top of that, there was an individual that asked a question about Assad who didn't disclose, or CNN didn't disclose certainly, that she was a former Obama for America worker. I think that's kind of important because if you're a political operative who worked for an establishment politician, and Tulsi is anti-establishment, we might need to know that, CNN, so clearly they haven't learned their lesson after seeing all the backlash they got when they planted a bunch of political operatives in Bernie Sanders' audience when they did a town hall with him. Now, another question where she was forced to play defense was on the issue of socialism. Before I give you her answer and how she had to defend herself, look at the way that the question was framed.
Right now, the Democratic legacy is being warped and repositioned as a socialist agenda. So, Congresswoman, my question for you is as follows. How will you counter this perception? Because as they say in marketing, perception is reality. Yeah. And in doing so, restore the democratic ideals to their original truths.
Yeah. But as you see, so many of these labels are misused, misunderstood to the point
so how would you define
where people
yourself?
Don't have any idea what they even mean anymore.
So you're not a capitalist?
I'm an independent-minded person. I'm a Democrat, and my sole focus and purpose is to figure out how we can best serve the people of this country.
So do you see what I mean? Every single question, it doesn't matter whether or not it was applicable to Tulsi or not specifically, was framed in this ruthlessly antagonistic way where she had to prove that she's not a horrible person. And that frustrated me to no end because the bias is overt. And CNN didn't really even seem to want to hide it. And when there weren't these overtly biased questions, then they were just fluff questions. Now, look, I've said this once, I'll say it again. I'm not against individuals being critical of candidates, even if I support them. But there's a line between being ruthlessly antagonistic and trying to push a candidate for clarification where there are perceived weaknesses. And I do think that CNN did, in fact, cross that line. With that being said, the entirety of this town hall was not a complete disaster because, like I said, I do think that Tulsi Gabbard performed well given the circumstances. So, for example, probably my favorite clip of the night and my favorite answer that she gave was in response to a question about rape and sexual assault in the military. I mean, it's clear that she shined here. Take a look.
As one woman officer to another, I'd like to know what you would like to do to stop sexual assault in the military. And as Commander-in-Chief, will you commit to signing the Military Justice Improvement Act should it come across your desk?
Yes. I led the introduction of the Military and Justice Improvement Act in the House of Representatives, so absolutely I would sign it into law as your President and Commander-in-Chief. As a fellow service member, we have lived through experiences ourselves and things that our fellow brothers and sisters in uniform have gone through. I have sat through hearings and engaged with leaders from the Department of Defense in my role as a member of the Armed Services Committee, where unfortunately there is a lack of recognition of the serious change that needs to take place for there to be a true path for justice for victims of sexual assault in the military. I believe that we still today don't know how rampant sexual assault in the military is because there is still a fear of retaliation, there is a stigma, and people who don't want to be known as that one. She or he is that one who went against the team, who turned their back. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And we know people ourselves who have gone through this and felt like they had no place to turn. So this legislation is so important because it provides that path outside of the chain of command where you know that there is no one, whether it's your team leader, or platoon leader, or your first sergeant, or your commander, there is no one who will be able to stop your pursuit of justice and accountability if you're a victim of assault in the military. This is such an important issue. Thank you for raising it. It's one that I'm going to continue to fight for. Thank you.
So that was incredibly touching and incredibly powerful. And what you saw there was a really genuine moment where Tulsi made a direct connection to a member of the audience who asked a question, a really important question. And seeing Tulsi's response there and seeing how well she performed makes me feel even more frustrated about the fact that CNN was out to get Tulsi the entire time, because had you not been overly antagonistic, you would have potentially given her more opportunities to make those types of direct connections. So it's frustrating. But nonetheless, again, I don't want to make this only about CNN's bias and the antagonistic nature of this town hall, because I do think there were other good moments. So, for example, she was asked about climate change, and for the most part, I think she gave a virtually perfect answer with one exception.
Why does this issue not have more political traction, and with what urgency will you address it if you are elected president?
Yeah, thank you. You know, before I ran for Congress, I served on our Honolulu City Council. District that is one of the largest city councils in the country, represented close to 100,000 people. And one of the things that we went through in our deliberations and bringing in experts and meeting with planners, city planners, was the impact of climate change on our home as an island state. This wasn't some far-off theory or some possibility in the next generation that people might have to face. This was in the next 10, 15, 20 years, how much are the sea levels going to rise that are going to start taking over our communities? And we're seeing this now. There was just a resolution passed in Hawaii calling for an emergency because homes and roads are being eroded because of these rising sea levels in the ocean. So we know how urgent this is, as do many people in this country. I think there are a number of reasons we can look to why Washington hasn't taken this more seriously, and I think one of the big ones is the big influence of money in politics, as well as industries like the fossil fuel industry continue. You have high-powered lobbyists who try to block and get in the way of real legislation being passed. But this is something that will require us as people to stand up and make sure that our voices are heard to the leaders of this country to understand the seriousness of this threat and how bold action must be taken to protect us, to protect our home and our planet and our future. Yes, there are things that we can do in our everyday lives to try to make this change, But this really needs to happen at the national level, and it needs to happen at the global level.
So overall, I really liked what she did there because I think that she essentially played all the greatest hits when it comes to climate change. Not only did she tie it to a real-life issue, such as rising sea levels and how that would impact an island state like Hawaii, but she also talked about the reason why there's been inaction. It's largely due to money and politics. She also talked about this not necessarily being an individual issue, but more so an issue where government has to take action, and there needs to be global action, and that's what she'd do as president. Now, the reason why I say it was almost perfect, virtually perfect with one exception, is because if you'll recall, the way that the individual asked her that question was he made urgency a prime concern there, and I think that if she would have addressed the elephant in the room, then it would have been a 10 out of 10, but I give her a 9.5 otherwise. So what's the elephant in the room that I'm talking about? The Green New Deal. And she didn't mention the Green New Deal, namely because even if she says that she supports it, she hasn't co-sponsored it. And part of the reason why she hasn't co-sponsored it is because she does have her own climate change legislation, to be fair. It's called the OFF Act. However, this was written before we knew about the IPCC's 12-year timeline. And what Tulsi's OFF Act aims for is 100% renewable energy by 2035, but that would be too late given what we know now about needing to take drastic action within the next 12 years. So as a presidential candidate, I need you to demonstrate to me that you are able to adapt in the event new scientific data comes out. And that's exactly what happened. We had a phenomenal piece of legislation with the OFF Act introduced by Tulsi Gabbard in the last congressional session, but now we need it to be even more ambitious in order to meet the IPCC's 12-year deadline. Now I get it because you've been pushing for this legislation for more than a year now, and you don't want to just abandon it, but what she should have said was, look, I take a kitchen sink approach to climate change. I support both the OFF Act, which is my legislation, but I also support the Green New Deal because I do think we need to meet the IPCC's 12-year deadline, and the Green New Deal really is the only actual framework for climate change that would address that specific urgency. And I think that that probably could have made her answer better. Because think about this, when we talk about healthcare, we always have to attach a policy prescription to it. And that policy prescription is obviously Medicare for all. So we should be doing the same thing when it comes to climate change. And I think she needs to come on board with the Green New Deal. I mean, it's been long enough. I get that you say that there's vagueness to it, Tulsi, but co-sponsor it and then try to improve it. Don't sit out and say, well, I have my own legislation. We need you to be able to adapt. So that's where I think she went wrong, but I don't want to shit on her answer too much because overall, she's saying what I need her to say when it comes to climate change. I just need her, rather, to acknowledge that there is this 12-year deadline and I am pledging to meet that 12-year deadline. So it was a virtually perfect answer. It would have been much better had she talked about the Green New Deal. So it's kind of getting awkward because she's not addressing the Green New Deal head on. And even if you have your own legislation, you got to talk about what's popular and what has name recognition, in my opinion. Another thing here, the question of Ilhan Omar came up, and before we get to Tulsi's answer, I just want to give you a look at the way that this was framed, because you could have guessed it was framed very terribly, in a horrible way that both sides is the situation.
I'm troubled by the increase in both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism that's infecting discourse on both sides of the political aisle.
I do not like that framing, because when you both sides an issue like anti-Semitism, what you're essentially doing, and I don't know anything about this individual who asked that question, but you can assume that if she's saying, oh, well, there's anti-Semitism on the left, well, what's she alluding to? Because there's no real anti-Semitism or hate on the left to the extent that there is on the right, so you can't both sides this. But what is she alluding to? Oh, well, criticisms of Israel is tantamount to anti-Semitism. That's essentially what we're being primed to believe here when she says something like that. Now, this is something that she probably did unwittingly. I don't think that she was trying to come in with this nefarious agenda to get us to think that criticisms of Israel is tantamount to anti-Semitism, but that's essentially what happened. So just understand there that when you frame a question like that, you're reshaping the discussion in a really disingenuous way. Now, Tulsi Gabbard went on to give a response about Ilhan Omar, and then she condemned, hate as a whole. And then she was asked specifically about Ilhan Omar's comments. And this is really, I think, the one instance where I was actually disappointed in Tulsi's response.
Ilhan Omar suggested that support for Israel in Congress is, quote, all about the Benjamins, and criticized lawmakers just this past week for supporting Israel as potentially having, quote, allegiance to a foreign country. What do you think about these statements, and do you think this is anti-Semitic?
Well, let's look at the bigger issue here. The bigger issue is, there's a couple actually, of making sure that as members of Congress and as people in this country, we can have open dialogue about our foreign policy. As there are criticisms levied about dual loyalty. Again, as I mentioned in the last question, I've been on the receiving end of those types of attacks, so I can understand how offensive they can be. Where just because I am a Hindu, people assume that therefore I must be loyal to some other interest or some other place.
But what about these specific statements? You're talking broadly. These specific statements, were they anti-Semitic?
There are people who have expressed their offense at these statements. I think that what Congresswoman Omar was trying to get at was a deeper issue related to our foreign policy. And I think there's an important discussion that we have to be able to have openly, even though we may end up disagreeing at the end of it, that we've got to be able to have that openness to have the conversation.
But you're not willing to go as far as saying it's anti-Semitic.
What I'm saying is what she was trying to bring up was something that was a deeper issue. Okay. And I don't believe that her intent was to cause any offense to anyone.
That wasn't necessarily the worst defense of Ilhan Omar that I've seen, but was it the best? No, not really. And when she talked about dual loyalty and it being Hindu-phobic to question her ties to Modi, I just don't find this argument persuasive at all, because the argument is being made in good faith by progressives who aren't Hindu-phobic, who are questioning why she posed for photo ops with someone who is a Trumpian figure. He's India's version of Donald Trump. So we're not saying, hey, you're both Hindu, there's something fishy going on here. We're saying, why would you want to pose for photo ops and be associated with someone who is kind of a bad guy? I mean, we grill other presidential candidates for posing for photo ops with war criminals like Benjamin Netanyahu all the time. So why can't we question why Tulsi's choosing to pose for photo ops with a different extremist and war criminal? Do you see what I mean? It's almost like she's invoking Hindu phobia to shut down criticism, which is kind of similar to the way that individuals who don't want you to criticize Israel will invoke anti-Semitism to get you to shut up. And it seems disingenuous to me. And I think that she hasn't heard this argument, which is why she keeps making it. But we're making this argument in good faith. And what it seems like is she's trying to invoke identity politics in order to not really explain why she chose to pose for photo ops with Narendra Modi. Now, I'll ask her about this when she comes on my show. She is still planning to come on my podcast, because I do think that it's important for her to explain why she chose to pose for photo ops with someone who's an objectively bad person, I think. So I don't find her argument persuasive here with regard to Hindu phobia. I do think Hindu phobia is something that is problematic in the United States because there's so little visibility for individuals who are Hindu. But in this instance, as a leader, I don't find her argument persuasive. Now, when it comes to what she said about Ilhan Omar, I wasn't super pleased and impressed here because she didn't unequivocally say that what Ilhan Omar did was not anti-Semitic. She claimed that Ilhan probably didn't intend for it to come off that way, but Tulsi still kind of implied that, well, since some people took it that way, then maybe it's a problem. But again, you can't take bad faith arguments as evidence that something is or isn't anti-Semitic, because the same types of bad faith arguments are being made right now about Tulsi Gabbard being an Assad toady. So if we were to say, oh, well, look, some people are saying she is an Assad apologist, so maybe it's true since some people are saying it, then what we're doing is we're allowing the right and our opponents to frame the discussion when we shouldn't be doing that. We should say, no, it's not anti-Semitic. No, Tulsi's not an Assad apologist. That's completely ridiculous. So that's why I wasn't impressed with her response here overall, but I don't want to give you the impression that I wasn't pleased with her performance, because what she was working with here was an incredibly antagonistic atmosphere of individuals who were just chomping at the bit to try to put her on defense and trying to, smear her. And clearly, this is CNN trying to curate a specific set of questions that would, in fact, make Tulsi Gabbard look bad, because she's someone who the establishment, frankly, just does not like. So overall, given that situation, I do think that she did a phenomenal job, but I do think that CNN largely was holding her back. They kind of clipped her wings and wouldn't allow her to truly fly. And that pissed me off, because it's like, if you're going to do these town halls and give each candidate town halls, then why aren't you bringing up the baggage for all of the other candidates? I mean, if you watch the town hall with Pete Buttigieg, no baggage was brought up. It was all just fluff questions. So it's frustrating that they really target Tulsi Gabbard and also Bernie Sanders. They take these progressives and they intentionally try to put them on defense and make them look bad in order to elevate the more establishment-friendly candidates. And that was on display here. So Tulsi did phenomenal in spite of what CNN was trying to do. Could she personally have done better? Sure, but I mean, she didn't really have to do much to improve. I still think she did phenomenal here. But CNN, they're so biased, and this is why people don't trust them and why they don't have credibility. It's because even when you give a candidate a platform and you are doing something that's seemingly beneficial to them, they're still doing it in an underhanded way to ultimately bring them down. And that is just, it's the definition of bias in media. It's the definition of trying to manufacture consent that the establishment deems appropriate.
Mike is a total loser, so don't hit the subscribe button, okay? And whatever you do, folks, do not hit the notification bell either. Mike treats me so unfairly.